Hello, welcome to Classical Greek Latin. This is Greek lesson 10 for Crosby and Schaeffer chapter 8. And today, my name is Josh and I'm the teacher for this course. And today we are going to be talking about the imperfect indicative active verb, namely omega verbs. All right, so let's jump into this pretty quickly here. And this is a pretty simple lesson, but let's go ahead and just take it step by step. All right, let's take a look at this opening line they give us just for fun. So, ergon deuden onedos aergie de te onedos. Right, so they tell us work is no disgrace, but idleness is. All right, and just for fun, let's take a look at the word for work, ergon, which, let me zoom in a little bit here for you. You can see that better. There we go. All right, so we have ergon here, which means work. And if you look here, the word they're translating as idleness is not technically idleness. It's which means not or non. And then ergie means like workness. So non-workness is basically what it means. So you have work and then you have workness, idleness. It's a diminutive of ergon, but then you have it negated by the alpha, right? But anyway, good advice, but that's just for fun. But let's talk about what the imperfect tense means. Okay, so let's talk about, so imperfect is the tense. That comes from the Latin word tempus, temporis, which means time. And you can think of verbs as time, past, present, future, generally speaking, but a better way to think of Greek words is how is the action affecting the present, or how is it relating to the present? So don't get bogged down in that, but it's always important to remember that languages don't have an exact one-to-one translation, and we want to understand Greek from the Greek perspective as much as possible. So imperfect is our tense. Okay, so you have tense, and then you have indicative. And all this word means is that it indicates something, it points to something, it shows something, right? And this is what you call the mood, or the mode, right? So as we get further along, you have subjunctive, optative, that sort of thing. That's the mood, okay? And then you have the it says active, and what that means is that the subject is acting upon the direct object, right? So the voice, that's what, is it happening to the subject, or is the subject doing this action to someone else? So active means that the subject is doing it to someone else, and that is what we would call voice. So we have tense, mood, and then voice. And again, don't get bogged down with technicalities. But that's that. All right, so the imperfect, they give us some good examples here. This tense denotes action continued, repeated, customary, or attempted in the past. So imperfect, you could think of this as it's not perfect. And so imperfect versus perfect is another tense we'll get to later, but perfect means an action that began in the past, we started in the past, but then it's continuing to the present. For example, we usually use the word in English have. So someone asks you, what have you been doing today? They're asking you for perfect verb response. That is to say, what have you been doing, and even are still doing it now? So if I were to answer that question, I have been grocery shopping today. Presumably, for sake of argument, you're still in the grocery store shopping, right? Or maybe going to the market. It's a big ordeal, all day long thing, farmer's market maybe. I have been shopping today. That's perfect because the action is in the past, but it's still affecting the present, right? Imperfect is something that was in the past, but it stopped and it's no longer happening, right? So I always say that in college, my roommate was Chinese, good friend of mine. But what I'm saying is not that he's not Chinese anymore. He's still Chinese, but he's no longer my roommate. So he was my roommate, but he's not now. So it's not that he has been my roommate. So say my senior year of college, I would use the imperfect. He has been my roommate for going on 3 years. But because I'm out of college now and that's in the past and done, I would say he was my roommate. So that's the imperfect. It's imperfect because it's not perfect, and it's not perfect because it's not affecting the present anymore, if you will. Okay, so rule of thumb, if you translate an imperfect tense as was or was doing something, that you're usually going to be right. Okay, that'll give you enough sense of what is going on in the sentence to fine-tune it according to context and to provide your own interpretation or translation, as they call it. All right, so they give us the word powell here. So the root of this word is p alpha upsilon, pow. A powon, I was stopping, I kept stopping, I used to stop, I tried to stop. You're not gonna, I tried to stop. Crosby and Schaeffer, they know what they're talking about, but don't think about this one, try to stop, too often. I used to stop, I kept stopping, I was stopping. Again, was, that's going to be your best bet to give you an idea of what's going on. And then if you have to use these other expressions as kind of help you find your way through the translation, through the Greek, to get a sense of what the Greeks meant, then you can move on to these others here. Okay, so that's that. So if you remember a powell, I stop in the present tense, right? This is imperfect, so I was stopping, a powell. And we'll talk about this epsilon on the front. It's called an augment. And we'll talk about these endings, which are technically secondary endings. We'll talk about that in a moment. So we have epauon, I was stopping. Epaues, you, singular, were stopping. Epaue, he, she, it was stopping. And this new, that's just a movable new. You've seen this before. They give us a sample explanation of that. If you go back to page 6, it comes at the end here. If the next word is beginning with a vowel, the new prevents this epsilon from combining with that vowel. And also, if this happens to be the last word in the sentence, you will have that new there. Okay? And then, so that's the singular, first, second, third person. And now you have the plural, first, second, third person. So, apau omen, we were stopping. Apau ete, you all were stopping. Epauon, they were stopping. Okay? Ago introduces, this is not a new augment. You know, it's not that we have epsilon here and then we have eta here. The eta is here because of a combination of epsilon with alpha that we will talk about in a moment. But before we do that, I want to show you this book that I've posted a picture of this book on my Instagram page. If you'd like to keep up with us over on Instagram, I do put updates over there. But it's the Greek Paradigm Handbook. And let me just take you through this real quick. So we'll do a quick refresher. This is a great book. Crosby and Schaeffer have most of this in their book, but this book is very helpful because it catalogs it with just the charts without all the grammatical explanation. So you need both. You need the grammatical explanation, but when you've forgotten a chart or want to compare charts, this book is very helpful. So let's take a look here. We'll go to the table of contents. All right, let me zoom in a little bit. So we want to look at verbs. All right, so we want to go to page 61. Let's do that real quick. Okay, so we're at page 61 here, and there's our table of contents for the verb section. We want to look at the present. All right, so we have present and then we have progressive. So let's go to page 69. before we do that though, let's take a look here. I'm just flipping through here. I made mention of secondary endings about the imperfect. So the present tense, pauo, paues, paue, as you've seen before, these are primary endings. All right. So this is very helpful here because you have the endings, the primary endings, but then in the brackets they show you the phonetic evolution of how it came to look this way. Okay. So if we look on page, I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, but this is interesting and also helpful. But if we go to page 7 in Crosby and Schaeffer, okay, you see here in the plural you have what we call theme vowels is omicron, and then with the ending men, epsilon with the ending te, and then here you have an omicron that has become an omicron upsilon, right? And then over here, and then there's, I'll get back to that third person plural in just a second, but then here you have pauo, and you have paues, right? And then you have paue. So you have that epsilon theme vowel that has been transformed, and they show you how that happens here. Okay, so in the brackets, and again, they give you a full explanation here. I won't read you the whole explanation there, but they explain to you the phonetic evolution of how you, say, for example, got usi when you added nsi and nti to an omicron, right? So the nu would drop out and then lengthen the omicron to omicron upsilon, and you end up with usi. And then the nu there is just movable, right? That is, it separates vowels from colliding. The end of this vowel at the end, the beginning of a vowel in the next word, or if it's this word comes at the end of a sentence. But this is cool because it shows you the primary endings there, and then it does the same thing with the secondary endings. Okay, OPT just means optative. We're not talking about that right now. But this gives you the secondary endings, right? So keep this in mind. So you have nu, sigma, nothing, a third person singular, and then in the plural, men, te, and then nu here, right? And son is going to be aorist tense, but we're not talking about that right now. So let's just look at the nu. Okay, and now if we flip the page, this is page 65. We initially said page 69. So let's go over to that real quick. Okay, so we've seen this before. Crosby and Schaeffer used the sample word powell, which means to stop. This is luo, which means I loose, or to loose, or has like the idea of unraveling something, the idea of loosing something or destroying it, right? If you untie your shoelaces, you loosen them. You could say you've ruined your shoes in the sense that they're not going to stay on your feet very well. But okay, but this is the present indicative active, so we've learned this just with powell as a sample verb in Crosby and Schaeffer. But they give you just the forms as they appear normally, with separately from having given us the history, the phonetic shifts a few pages earlier. So this handbook is really good. I really recommend getting one. So yeah, o, es, e, omen, ete, usi for present tense, right? I loose. And then they give you, flip the page, imperfect, indicative, active, right? So eluon, elues, elue, there's that movable nu, eluomen, eluete, eluon. So they give you a nice, clean, cut and dried, simple presentation on how that verb is going to appear in text. But if you do want to know the history of how these endings came to be, which is very useful to memorization and also very useful to seeing the rhyme and the reason throughout the Greek language and making it more intuitive, that is available and provided for in this little handbook. So this is the Greek Paradigm Handbook. All right, there you go. But yeah, I recommend getting a copy of that. It's not too expensive if I remember correctly, but it's very, very useful. Okay, so let's go back to the page we're supposed to be on. Okay, so here we go. All right, so formation. All right, so we still need to talk about ago and why the eta is there, but let's do this step by step. Formation. The imperfect tense is built on the present stem. That just means that the root of the word pau is going to be, it's the same root that we use for the present. So pao with an omega, I stop, and then epaon, I was stopping, but the root of the word is the same, okay? So present stem showing the variable vowel omicron or epsilon, right? That's the variable vowel here. Let's see here. Omicron, eta, or epsilon, excuse me, and then omicron, right? And then here, it's easier to see the thematic vowel in the imperfect. We have omicron, epsilon, epsilon, right? And the present becomes epsilon, iota, sigma, ace because of the evolution that we talked about. And then here it becomes epsilon, iota, a. Again, because of the evolution that we saw earlier. But, all right, so the theme vowels are the same. And then so here, we're just adding the secondary endings, which, like we talked about out of the handbook, and we saw in the handbook is nu, sigma, nothing for third person singular, and then mente, and then nu is what you're adding on, okay? And then the full form is on as e, omen, ete, on. All right, so showing the variable vowel omicron epsilon being a secondary tense, it differs. So secondary doesn't mean anything except that it's using these endings. The secondary is arbitrary. Okay, so instead of omega here, we have a nu for the first person singular. These are the secondary tenses, the secondary endings. Okay, so secondary tense using secondary endings, it differs from the present having the augment. Okay, one, the augment, that's the epsilon is added to the front of the root of the word. Okay, for each and every person, singular and plural, for second, third. The secondary endings, that's what we have here, nu, sigma, nothing, mente, n. And I say third person singular, nothing, I mean that epsilon is technically a theme vowel. I don't want to bog you down with details, but all right. So it is found only in the indicative. Okay, so that means that we talked about the mood or the mode up here. Okay, so these endings are going to change when we're not in the indicative. Okay, so these endings, when you see them, you know this verb is indicative. Okay, it is found only in the indicative. All right, the secondary endings, that is. Okay, augment, number 43, paragraph 43. All secondary tenses of the indicative may be recognized by what is called augment. So recognize, you're reading along in Latin, you come across this verb, this word, you're pretty sure it's a verb, and you know how do we translate this verb? What tense is it? The augment is going to be the giveaway. Okay, that for the addition of that epsilon on the front will tell you that it's imperfect, joined with these endings here. Okay, this is of two kinds. All right, so number one, syllabic verbs with initial consonant prefer epsilon by way of augment. All right, syllabic and then versus temporal. Don't worry about that terminology. All that means is that the first letter of the root of the word, in this case, pao, is a consonant. So you augmented epsilon. Technically, you augment everything with epsilon in the imperfect. But, like we referenced earlier, when you get a verb that begins with a vowel, like ago, you're still augmenting with an epsilon. Back in the way back history of Greek, you would augment it with an epsilon, but then it came to be through combining those epsilon and alpha together became eta, right? So then the Greek speaker wouldn't have thought of these things, but it's helpful for us as English speakers to understand why these things look to be different when really they're the same. Okay. So when you epsilon, this is a good chart to be familiar with. Very simple chart here. Basically, it tells you how the vowel changes when you add an epsilon to it, right? So alpha becomes eta. When does alpha become eta? Like an ago. So if you put an epsilon, so let's do this. So epsilon plus alpha equals eta. That's what that means. All right. So epsilon plus alpha becomes eta. Epsilon plus epsilon becomes eta. Okay. And then the given note here, sometimes it becomes epsilon iota, A versus A. Very similar phonetics, different symbols. Okay. But for the sake of learning here, let's try to keep it simple. So epsilon plus epsilon equals eta. Epsilon plus omega, omicron equals omega. Epsilon plus iota equals long iota. And then epsilon plus upsilon equals a long upsilon. Okay, these last two are not very common. You won't see that very often, but it is a thing. These are listed really in order of occurrence, frequent occurrence. The first three are what you'll see the most. Okay, so when the first syllable of the root of a word is a diphthong, again, epsilon plus alpha iota becomes eta subscript iota, and you get the idea. But that's what that means, okay? So you have epsilon plus equals, right? So it's just telling you what it will look like, all right? So that's how, this will be the form you'll see in a text that you might be reading in Greek, but that's how it happened. That was the original form. So if you see, say, a word that begins with this, well, one, it tells you that it's probably imperfect. And then two, if you need to look that word up in the lexicon, it's going to be under the spelling that begins with its original form, alpha, upsilon in this case, for example, right? It won't be under eta, upsilon, because that's the imperfect form. The verb will appear in the dictionary lexicon, rather, in its present tense, right? So adding the augment, we're making it with the secondary endings added to the end. Those two things together are making it an imperfect verb. So we know we can recognize the verb in a text as imperfect, but if we need to look it up in a lexicon, we need to look up the original spelling of the word before the augment epsilon was added, in which case it'll start with these vowels if that applies to the particular verb at hand. Okay? So verbs that start with vowels, not very difficult, but not as easy as verbs that start with consonants, if that makes sense. Okay? So just to drive that home, let's look at ago. All right? So there we go. So say I come across egon. All right, so I say, oh, I was leading, or it could be they were leading, depending on the context, because they're the same. First person singular, third person plural, they're the same here. So if I couldn't think of what this word was, egon, and I want to look it up, I know because of the secondary ending here is probably imperfect. So when I go to the lexicon, I look up the lexicon, I would go to, because I know this rule, that epsilon plus alpha equals eta, I know it's either going to begin with an alpha or either going to begin with an epsilon, because you see that a word that begins with alpha or epsilon, when augmented with epsilon, becomes eta in either case. So I know that this word originally begins with alpha or epsilon, all right? This particular word, I would look up the alpha first and see, okay, ago from egon. Phonetically, the phonetic evolution there makes sense. And then I would think, okay, does the meaning of that word makes sense in this sentence. Okay, a little off topic there, but I think that is helpful. So put any comments or questions in the comments below, and I will try to answer those as I can. Okay, so let's go on here. So they want you to inflect the imperfect indicative active of pempo and athroizo. All right, so let's go ahead and do that real quick, just so that you can see it done from scratch. So we'll go with pempo. All right, so we're going to do pempo, which means I send. All right, so we're going to make that imperfect indicative and active. All right, so we'll go first person, second person, third person. I like to put my singular and plural side by side. First, second, third person, and then singular, and then plural. Okay. So pempo, the root of the word is pemp. Okay. Pemp, that's the root of the word. But we want to make this imperfect. All right, so we're going to put the augment on the front. All right, so it's going to be smooth breathing. All right, that means it's not breathy. It's not like, it doesn't have an H on the front, right? Basically, it's not he, it's epempo or epempo, right? So we have the augment, and now we need our secondary ending instead of our primary ending. So instead of the omega, we're going to put omicron nu. Okay? Now, accent, in a verb, the accent is recessive. That means it's going to fill out as much as possible the full 3 more rule. Okay? So we have a short omicron here, 1 more, short epsilon here, 2nd more, and then a third more here with a short epsilon again. So our accent is going to go just like that. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and put the root of the word here, pemp. Let's put that all the way through, and then we'll come back and add our endings. So pemp, pemp. Okay, so let's go through and do augments. We'll add all the augments on, and they're all going to have smooth breathing. Okay, now let's put the secondary endings on. So we have epsilon, sigma, epsilon, and then the movable nu. Then you have omen, ete, and then on. All right, so now let's go back and accent everything correctly. Okay, so short epsilon, short epsilon, short epsilon. All right, 3 more days total. All right, let's take a look here. Short epsilon, short epsilon, short epsilon. Put our accent there. All right, now we have omen, so we've added an extra syllable. So our accent's going to move. So we have 1 more right here, short epsilon, short omicron, and then short epsilon. So that's 1, 2, 3. Right? If we were to go here again, we'd be outside that. We'd be at 4 mores, which is unacceptable to the Greek ear. So the accent's going to move in closer to the end there to maintain the 3 more rule. generally speaking, the 3-syllable rule. All right, this is the recessive accent on verbs. This is all verbs function this way when it comes to accents. All right, so we have epsilon, epsilon, epsilon. Okay, short, short, short. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and then here, omicron short, epsilon short, epsilon short. 1, 2, 3. Mores. Okay, there's the penult, or excuse me, antepenult. Not technical term, not very important, but there you have it. Okay, so that is Pempo converted to and conjugated in the imperfect present, or excuse me, imperfect indicative active forms. Okay, so that's that. And let's see here, we're almost done. Dative of manner. Okay, this is a very simple concept. Dative of manner, when a verb, excuse me, when a word is in the dative, sometimes it tells you the manner in which it was done. So there are two big ones. There's dative of manner and there's dative of instrument, right? So you can think of manner as good or bad manners, right? If you are shouting at the table, that's a bad manner. But it's the way in which you're having dinner, right? You shouldn't be shouting at the dinner table, right? So if you were to say shouting, you would put the shouts, like they were eating dinner with shouts. That the shouts, krauge, would be in the dative form, right? Because it's the manner in which they're having dinner. Okay. In English, it's bad manners, but anyway. All right. So, and then the other one would be dative of instrument, right? So, the boy hit the ball with a dative bat, right? So that would be his instrument with which he hit the ball, right? And that the bat in that instance would be a dative also. But here we have dative of manner. It's the thing or way in which something is done. Okay. And I will show you an example of this combined with an example of this next section here. So in just a second. So number 45, new idea. So we talked about dative of manner, which I'll give you a sample here. They give you an example here. They are fleeing, or they flee in silence, right? Sige is in the dative singular feminine here, right? So in silence, right? It's the manner. How are they doing it with silence? It's the manner of how they're fleeing, right? Okay, but I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Let's look at paragraph 45 here. Men and de, simply put, I'll let you read all this on your own. It does look complicated, but I'll show you a sample here from the homework that will clarify things pretty well. But basically, men is not really translatable into English. It just means that there's going to be a contrast or like a comparison that's coming up. So men, you could say on the one hand something, and then but but on the other hand you have this, right? All right, so let's see here. So they give you, this is all somewhat confusing because they're omitting really the full sample here. So let's see here. All right, so let's just go to the homework and we'll look at sample number 4 here, example number 4. All right, so let's read this together. Hoi, let me zoom in on this for you a little bit. All right, number 4, page 24 in Crosby and Schaeffer. Hoi men, God, krauge, ektes agoras, epheugon. Right, so there's the first men. On the one hand, all this happens. I'll translate in a second. Hoi de, but on the other hand, de, right, this is the contrast. Hoi de sige tas skenas Effulaton. Effulaton. All right. So we'll translate this into English real quick. So hoi, definite article here. There's no subject that goes along with this, so it's being treated as a substantive here, the men, because this is nominative plural masculine. So the men, not a real translation, but on the one hand, for the men on the one hand, right? Hoi mengar. Krauge, so there's your dative of manner. With a shout or with noise. Really, it's shout. It's shout, outcry, shout. So with a shout, that's the manner in which they're doing it. That's your dative of manner. Ektes agoras efugon. So out of the genitive singular market. Okay, and then there's your, from last chapter, your alpha instead of eta following a row. Okay, so out of the genitive singular feminine market, they, right, epsilon, augment. A lot of review here. Epsilon augment, secondary ending on. Right, this could be first person singular, I was fleeing. But we know it to translate it as third person plural, they were fleeing because of hoi. Right, that's our plural nominative there. Right, so the men, implied men, for, on the one hand, men, with the dative of manner, with a shout, out of the market, they were fleeing. Okay, now here comes the contrast. So with a shout, that is loudness, right? They were fleeing out of the market. Hoi de, on the other hand, hoi, the men, nominative plural masculine, implied men. The men, but, on the other hand, you could say, but the men sige, with silence, dative manner again. Tas skenas, the tense, effulaton. They were guarding. Okay. So that is a good sample here. I'm sorry to steal your thunder there and translate one of your homework lines for you, but it's a good example. It ties everything together. Okay, so you have the compare contrast with men and de. Right, you have dative of manner krauge with a shout, dative of manner sige with silence, right? And then you have sample sorting out the imperfect form based on context with effulaton and efugon. All right, so that's that. Let's take a look here. All right, something that's just interesting is the kappa tau lambda. It stands for kai ta loipa. There at the bottom, they give you a note. So it means the things, and the rest, or the things remaining, the leftovers, you could say. That's what that means. It's similar to the Latin etc., etc., and following, right? So, yeah, that's just for fun. That is fun. All right, let's take a look here. Is there anything else we need to talk about? Okay, so let's take a look at the vocab, see if there's anything weird there. Okay. Okay, final alpha is often elided. What that means is they're talking about the final alpha on Allah. And what that means is elided means it drops out if the next word starts with a vowel. So that's what that means. An example of that I give you right here is alem pempelman. Right, so that alpha has been elided, it dropped out. Okay, because it's easier to say ale and kind of tie that al, but with the epsilon there, rather than Allah right? It's just easier to drop out the alpha, or to say it in a fancy way, elide it, or drop it out. All right, but that's what that means. Final alpha is often elided. All right, that alpha is drops when a vowel comes next. Okay, very simple. Original ancients. Okay, so there you have a diminutive of arche. CF means confer. It means carry together in Latin. Barbarians, barbaros. Anyone who doesn't speak Greek is a barbarian, namely the Persians. That's how the Greeks saw it. Okay, so pretty straightforward stuff here. Nothing crazy. Yeah, that elided alpha, that's the only thing that's somewhat not straightforward, but pretty simple. Okay, that's the lesson for today. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you're doing well with your lessons. Feel free to drop comments or questions in the comments below. And if you like help with the homework, with the exercises here, we do have those on our Patreon page for patrons. The link for that is in the description below. It's $10 a month, and we go over all the exercises. So we explain them, we give the answers, and then explain them. It's like having a second lesson. So that the supplement lessons are over on our Patreon page. Check that out if you so desire. If you're having trouble with the Greek, that will be helpful to you. But go ahead and work through 40. My recommendation is 47A. Okay, what do the portions in heavy type tell us as to the number of the subject? Again, just parse this. Okay, so egon, again, not to steal your thunder, but this is going to be third person, right? Imperfect, indicative, active. So third person plural. Okay, so let me see here. Let me write this out in a way. So we have egon. Show you how I would write this out. Okay, so egon is going to be, it could be third person plural or first person singular. So let's just do first person first. So first person singular, okay, imperfect. All right, and again, I add the F on the end just to distinguish this from imperative. It's indicative. I abbreviate this, you don't have to if you don't want to. And then it's active, right? And that is egon parsed, right? And then the second possibility for this verb is third person, plural, all right? And then you would write, I'll just write it out. Perfect, imperfect, indicative, active, okay? And if you want to be zealous, you can also provide the original lexicon entry. So that's what you would do for exercise number A. Is just parse those words. Okay, so parse means to cut up. Conjugate means to join together. So when you conjugate, you write them out like ago, ages, age, agomen, agete, agusi, right? That would be the present tense. That would be conjugation. When you're given the word and you're just telling me what that particular form is, you're cutting it up, you're parsing it. So just parse these like I just showed you, all right? And it is good practice to go ahead and provide the original lexicon, how it appears in the lexicon, like I showed you with ago for egon, all right? All right, so which personal endings of the imperfect are identical? Okay, we talked about that. Which resemble endings of the present? Yeah, just compare the charts, and I don't want to, again, steal too much of your thunder there, but take a look at the charts and just see what is the same and what's different, right? Section B, translate these. We did number 4 together already. Okay, translate those, and I will provide the full translations for everything there on Patreon. And then here, again, we've done this before. Complete So provide the endings, right? So egg, that's our verb. They want it to be second person plural. All right. So that's going to be egete. Okay. So just do that, and then again, you have a noun here with a definite article, ton, right? Hipon, right? The horse as the direct object, and on. Okay. And then you have, I think the harder part, you have English to Latin. So let's see here. We got 5 sentences there, and that is all. Okay. So go ahead and do those exercises. I will provide the answers to those on Patreon. And this over here, let's take a look here. Oh, this is from Luke. The international language of the first century of our era was Greek. To carry its message to the world, therefore, the New Testament was written in Greek. The following passage is from St. Luke. Read through that if you can. That's interesting. All right. And compare it with an English translation of the Bible. I won't provide a translation of that for you from me on Patreon, but that does look fun. But yeah, compare your translation with an English translation of the Bible, Luke 6:45. Okay, this is just fun. This is just fun stuff here. So work through that if you so desire. And then our next lesson will be the future indicative active and the future infinitive active of omega verbs. All right. So that'll be 2 lessons from now. The next lesson coming out next week will be Latin, unless you're watching this later on in time and everything is available. But that is the lesson for today. So that is Greek lesson 10 for Crosby and Schaeffer chapter 8. And I hope that was helpful to you and not confusing. Again, if you have questions, comments, leave those below. And I'll try to get to those as I can. And if you'd like help with your homework, with the exercises, consider subscribing to our Patreon. The link for that is in the description below. All right. Thanks for joining us again, and have a good day. Bye.